My name's Pepper. In addition to my day job, I do a lot of workshops and classes around polyamory, and I hold events that cater to sort of non-monogamous communities. I've been doing that for most of a decade now. Yeah.
I'm Jen. I've been doing non-monogamy for over 12 years. Partnered with this guy who I help do a lot of workshops and other events with.
You want to go first?
I realized right about when I turned 18, I realized there was another way to have relationships, but I'd always been a little different. I'd always felt a little different about relationships.
I actually had parents who were in an open relationship. So I knew from a very young age that it was possible to have relationships that were not monogamous. And when I set out to date in high school, that's what I tried to do. I wasn't very successful in high school. So we've done a very good job of surrounding ourselves with polyamorous people. So actually it's fairly rare. But it's always sort of a concern, right? If we meet a neighbor on the street, right, and they see other lovers coming into our house or whatever, are they eventually going to figure it out, and is that going to be weird? And usually it's fine. So I don't think we personally have had any serious bad experiences. Yeah. So I have a background in queer theory, and I don't believe there really is natural states for human beings anymore. Like, sure, we have some biology, but we've been cultural beings for a long time now. And so I think it tends to be sort of fruitless to argue over this thing is natural or that thing is natural. I think we have cultures, and the cultures say, oh, this is what you should be doing. And often that becomes the natural thing for a while, or maybe it's the unnatural thing, but you should still be doing it. And I think a lot of our dialogue around natural and unnatural is really what we should be doing versus what we shouldn't be doing. But, we get up in the morning and we brush our teeth, and that's a deeply unnatural act, but it means our teeth last past age 30. Right? And we live in houses, which are, in many ways, unnatural boxes, but they protect us from the elements. So I think when studying humans and what they do in relation to culture, it's important to, for me at least, put aside questions of natural versus unnatural and say, what are the restrictions that the culture has, and what is outside of those restrictions, and how can we see all those things? These days grow up in a culture that says, you will have relationships with people and you will have certain powers over them. Like the power to tell them that they can't have relationships with other people, for example. And sometimes that power is gendered. Like between men and women, the power is that the guy gets to have more of the sex he wants than the woman, perhaps. And that power is the power of self-propagate, like systems of power self-propagate. And so there's a lot of people very highly invested in maintaining that power. And so things move forward. And they do, there are a bunch of things happening. We had the sexual revolution, feminism, right? Like queer rights struggle. There's sort of these dominoes falling over and these systems of power, I think unraveling is probably the right word. But it's a slow process, and there's a certain amount of inertia because people are invested in the ways that they can have power over other folks. And it is until they see that it's better to not have power over other folks that they can then give that up, declare truce, as it were, and move forward with sort of more mutually beneficial stuff. I do want to say that I think it is overly idealistic to assume that non-monogamy is not without power of its own. Here in the polyamory, like in certain ways.
I wouldn't make that assumption necessarily.
Yeah. In certain ways, like, yes, if people by and large have the ability to go have relationships or have sex with whoever they want, great. But in practice, it often doesn't work out that way. I've seen situations where partners had terrible double standards. If you get into some cross-cultural study, it's pretty You can find cultures that are non-monogamous but yet coercive. And I'm not going to name any, but we have some right here in the U.S. I don't think that it's necessarily that being not monogamous gives us the ability to be free from coercive relationships or power struggles or competition. Like I've seen quite a bit of competition in the polyamory communities. I feel like in many ways we have to address the other power imbalances in culture, right? So long as there are people who, are in extreme poverty or face things like racism, right? Then you have these sort of incredible imbalances of power in the culture. Or, here in the U.S., the imbalance of power between the extremely wealthy and folks who are poor or lower class, whatever. As long as you have that power differential, you end up with a certain amount of control in relationships. There's one thing we've noticed in doing workshops around polyamory, which is that polyamory does not thrive in a high power imbalance. So if you have a relationship where there's a high power imbalance, and we've heard one partner is cisgender and the other is transgender, for example, or it's an interracial relationship, or there's some other kind of strong power imbalance, then you tend not to get effective polyamory or any kind of non-monogamy out of it. You tend to revert to monogamy because the temptation to use all those things that monogamy gives us to control the other person becomes too huge to the person who is more powerful. In some ways, I see the poly deal as sort of like the prisoner's dilemma, positive outcome, if you know the prisoner's dilemma. The idea is that with cooperation, you gain greater rewards than competition. And it can be hard to manage because you don't necessarily know what the other person's going to do. Declaring the poly deal is, in some ways, doing that. You're giving up all those things that monogamy was supposed to get you. But at the same time, you then get to structure relationships the way you want. You get to have more than one if you want, and so on and so forth. So you can sort of attain whatever those relationship goals might be, so long as they involve more than one relationship. Right? My number is about 3.
My
Jen's
number's a solid 2.
2. And we get to have that number of partners now. If you talk to someone who's really not interested in having more than one partner, then of course the deal does not work for them. Monogamy is heavily sold in our culture, and to the detriment of often monogamous people who want to be monogamous, right? Like, I think being successfully monogamous in United States culture in the modern day is taking a lot of what you see on TV and putting it aside and learning to build long-term relationships without the tool, the sort of slightly ridiculous idealizations that the culture has handed you. In any number of realms, like the clothing we wear, the relationships we have, what we can, the jobs we have, like where we live. Culture has always exerted systems of conformity, and those always have mechanisms to punish you if you get out of line. Absolutely. And monogamy is just one more of those, I would say. Or the greater complex of how you should do relationships, how you should have sex, and so on. I think it's also a mistake, at least in our sort of very busy modern culture, I think it could be a mistake to assume that, like, polyamory, for example, is not without scarcity. In some ways, it seems like there's no scarcity. Like, I can bring up a dating site and find 100 potential partners, all of whom I'm available to and they're available to me. But people run out of time and other resources. Or sort of having all these people together in the same melting pot means that, well, let me back up and say, just because you become non-monogamous doesn't mean that you put aside all those things the culture said about who gets to be attractive and who doesn't. And so people who the culture for some reason does not consider attractive can actually have a very hard time dating because everyone else has other options, if that makes sense.
So Pep and I present a bunch of different workshops. One actually coming up pretty soon is jealousy and boundaries, and talking about how helping people figure out how they'd like to structure their relationship, what things they can do to feel safe in their relationships, and kind of taking a goal approach. You know, if my goal is to see other people, or see several other people, how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that feels safe, comfortable, and it's actually, they're really great. We really love doing them. You know, we get a lot of people come up later and we're like, thank you, that made a big difference. We didn't think about it that way. So it's really great. We also talk at a couple of different colleges about non-monogamy. Every semester, just go in and give a, hey, there's another option, there's other ideas here. The first question we get is, well, don't you get jealous? You know, it's almost always the first thing that comes out. Well, don't you get jealous? And talking about telling them that, you know, a lot of people go through a lot of work to not be jealous. You know, that there are options, that there's ways to deal with it. Thinking about it like you would think about an anger management kind of situation, right? Any kind of overwhelming feeling that you're having that you don't want to have for whatever reason, you know, there's ways to deal with that and ways to work with it. Yeah.
What other questions do we get that are common?
We get a lot of, oh, what about the children? Like, oh, could you raise a child in this situation?
How do you answer that?
I think mostly remind people that currently most of us didn't grow up in a two-parent household, right? A lot of us were raised by single parents or by aunts or by our grandparents. And that, you know, children who do well are doing well because they're in a loving situation and in a safe environment. And that could be one parent, that could be three parents, that could be, you know, two men, two women, you know, any combination of parenting as long as they are loved and taken care of. And we generally get a good response from that. Yeah. My favorite is, where does everyone sleep?
People get very curious about the
bedroom arrangements,
which is very interesting. I think they're usually asking, do you have threesomes? Yeah.
How do you deal with that one?
You know, we tell, I mean, we actually don't have a lot of threesomes.
Yeah.
So we tell them that, and sort of, it's funny, the question will come in, where does everyone sleep? And we'll answer with, this is what our sexual arrangements are. Because we know that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Which one of you is the real relationship?
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah.
When previously we'd present with Pepper and my other boyfriend at the time, and we'd sit up there and they would ask me, like, so if you're all in a car accident and Ari goes to one hospital and Pepper goes to another hospital, where are you going? And I'm like, well, if I was in the car, I assume I'm in an ambulance going to the hospital as well. But it's interesting how people try and pick it apart to find out which is which are you really in love with? Who's the real relationship?
The culture doesn't just teach us jealousy, but like sort of deeply invests us in jealousy. And that's particularly visible to me because I grew up in a household where my parents were in an open relationship. And I don't really get jealous. And so during our workshops, we often say, jealousy was something you learned at some point. And if you need to, you can unlearn it. We can say that there's a basic truth that you don't own people. People are remarkably contrary, in fact. And attempts to own or control people generally result in them getting out of your control. Yeah. I would like to be idealistic, but honestly, I think that we still have a lot of struggles ahead of us. In certain ways, sexuality is breaking out of the box, and the internet has been very important to that because people can now just put things up and everyone else gets to see them. There's no censorship is much harder. But sexuality, I feel like, is only one piece of the puzzle, and we still have huge, class differences. Gendered power is still a very real thing, though it's been reducing, right? And so on and so forth. And it is I feel like there is an ideal place out there where the contract is between the culture and the people, and the contract is that the people can live their lives more or less the way they want in the culture while still contributing. And in many ways, we have all the ability to do that right now. We have large machines to farm all our food and that sort of thing. Labor is significantly less necessary than it used to be. But it's going to be, I think, a long time and a lot of struggle, if we ever get to a place where the people who used to be in charge are willing to give that power up and create a more egalitarian society in general. We've gotten to a place where the option of polyamory is actually fairly well known in this particular region, and people will do things like they'll go to a new job, and they'll spend some time at the new job, and then they'll come out and they'll discover there are 3 other polyamorous people at that particular job. And so it's starting to get much like the queer movement was maybe in the 90s or late 80s, where people were coming out, and all of a sudden everyone seems to know someone who's doing relationships differently. That seems to be where we're getting to here in San Francisco. And I feel like that, just the creation of visibility itself is in some ways the most important thing to creating real, valid relationship options.
So I feel like it does take a lot for a person to put themselves out to another person and say, these are my faults, and this is who I am, and this is the person I am. And we, as non-monogamous people, we do it over and over and over again. It's not like I had to do it once to find my partner, be accepted, and press on. Like, we're constantly putting yourself in a position where people can say, you're a little weird, and I'm not going to go there with you. And so learning to be okay, even being better at embracing who you are, because you expect other people to embrace you, or you hope that they will. So becoming okay with yourself and becoming okay with all those little things that make you odd, makes us human. Yeah.
And I feel like monogamy creates sort of a sense of safety, perhaps sometimes an incorrect one, around relationships, because in theory your partner is with you and they won't look at anyone else, that's against the rules, they won't leave you for anyone else, and that's so on and so forth. Whereas we're sort of on the extreme other end of that. We have what you might call a primary relationship, but at the same time we hold space for other relationships becoming equally important to this relationship. We anticipate it. And that can be a very scary thing, to know that, on the one hand, it can be a very scary thing to sort of not have these sort of artificial, like, well, we just have to stay together because we have to stay together kind of stuff, but rather we stay together because we remain important to each other. We remain connected.
It's a choice, and it's a choice we make, like, literally every day, right? This is this is a person I wish to be with, because I choose to.
That's a big one.
That's just a big one. I think it's about trust. I think it's somebody you can, hand your vulnerabilities to and say, I trust you to take care of this. I'm going to hand you this little baby bird that is all of me, and trust that you aren't going to break it. And having them take that and be like, yes, absolutely, I'm going to carry this and hold this for you.
For me, love is just a feeling, right? Like I don't necessarily see the need to make it more than that, right? And I have a number of different partners, and for each one of them, love is a little different. But it's that very enjoyable feeling when I see the person.